Okay, so welcome back. I want to go over with you how to read this Pew Research study on religion in America. This is the quantitative side of the study. This is where we get the numbers. Um, but also just remember, as I said in the first lecture and explanation, this is self-reporting. People are calling themselves Christian, Mormon, Catholic, Buddhist. There's no one doing any quantitative meaning, like looking at the meaning behind things, looking at beliefs, looking at um, underlying understandings of things. It's just what people claim to be, what they label themselves. Nonetheless, the quantitative side can help us critique those qualitative discussions that we're having. The fact that Harold Bloom sees something, or that I see something, or that you have a certain view of religion in America. You may think you see a trend, uh, but that could be just because of who you hang with, who you spend time with, where you go to church or where you don't go to church. The fact if you're Buddhist or Muslim or have traveled a lot or have not traveled a lot, your kind of general surroundings affect how you see the world. So, and there may be people that you wouldn't think of as Christian if you're a Christian, or people that you wouldn't think of as Christian if you're a Buddhist who consider themselves so. So um, this quantitative, this numerical, this kind of more scientific, for lack of a better term, approach can kind of help us get some numbers to see if what we think we're seeing in these other studies, in Bloom's readings and some of the other readings that we're going to do, um, if there's validity to it, or if there are problems with it. And if what Bloom is saying doesn't seem to match up with the numbers, he may still be right. But that's because the numbers, the quantitative aspects, also have a certain level of interpretation involved with them. And that said, if you haven't watched um, the video that I mentioned, the little clip, it's about a 2-minute clip from a British comedy, that gets at interpretation, and we'll get into that more in just a minute. But if you haven't done that, go do that now and then start this over. Um, but that said, the quantitative matters. But even at the quantitative, there's an interpretive level. There's a sociologist named Peter Berger who was looking at certain statistics, certain trends in the 1960s. And he wrote a book back then called The Sacred Canopy. It was all about how the West, as it became um, more and more deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, by modernism, by postmodernism, that it was becoming less and less religious. And basically, he was arguing for the total secularization of Western society within a certain amount of time. By the 1990s, he changed his tune and he started talking about pluralism. Pluralism was the new thing. Um, and then in about the early 2000s, he starts to look at the fact that Pentecostalism, evangelicalism, and certain expressions of Islam are some of the fastest growing uh, belief systems worldwide, and even in the U.S. and in the West. And he found that the trends towards secularization, the trends towards pluralism, were really only within a certain class, a certain smaller class of highly affluent, um, highly educated classes. But for the most part, um, religion was not dying out. People were not becoming more secular. So those trends can change. What you think you see at one point within statistics and within a study like this may change over time. I like a writer, G.K. Chesterton. He said once, "I agree with the realistic Irishman who said he preferred to prophesy after the event." Um, just a good warning to think about when you're looking at trends, when you're looking at statistics. Things can change quickly. And in fact, this Pew study that you're going to look at, you're going to be reading, is talking about a decrease in self-described Christians in the U.S. and an increase in what we call unaffiliated. And I'll point out some of the issues within that in and of itself, but that trend could shift. There are other studies from Pew that point to possibilities that may not remain as it is. Within this study, they mentioned the lack of information from Asian Americans and how that might impact the numbers of Buddhists, the number of Hindus. But actually, if you look at Pew's own research in other studies on Asian Americans, the majority of U.S. Asian Americans are Christian. Significantly large size majority of Asian Americans are Christian Asians, not Buddhists, not Hindu. Now, the second and third largest are Hindus and Buddhists, but so the inability to speak the language, the fact that this study was done in English and Spanish, and that anyone who didn't speak those two languages really wasn't able to be reached by this study, can skew it, but it doesn't mean it's going to skew it necessarily more towards Buddhism or Hinduism, though it would a little bit. It may skew it away from those unaffiliated numbers. We just don't know. The other thing is, within this study itself, you see that African American communities are really pretty steadily religious. There's not the same kind of drop off as there are in some other of the Christian communities in this study within the African American communities. And that's important because African American communities, minorities in the country, Hispanic and black populations are growing and becoming less and less minorities. So that could impact future numbers. So a trend in a quantitative study isn't a prophecy. It's a trend. It's what's happening now, and that's why we want to look at this, because what's happening now matters. We need to understand it, but we have to look at it cautiously, because there's always an interpretive side. And again, coming back to that idea, there's always interpretation. Like I said, the clip from Yes, Prime Minister. Sorry, I have really dry British humor. I love it. But this clip on the bias in polling, you kind of see where, and the main character there talks about what the reputable versus the non-reputable pollsters. But the truth is, what you decide to ask, how you ask it, when and where you ask, these things can all shape the outcome of a study like this. And like he said, reputables, and the Pew study, Pew is a very reputable organization. Nonetheless, you can still see that there's some ways that even in the fact that they have to pull out headlines and section titles and little pull charts to kind of condense down the information to what they're looking for, that affects the way we see it. And so because this is a very reputable poll, that's why this is like a 200-page study. To really understand what's going on, you need to look at the deeper levels of the study. You need to read closely. Now, don't let that scare you. I'm not asking you to read all 200 pages in depth, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I wanted to show you what we're talking about there. That this study, Pew, very reputable organization, very well done study, very detailed, very in-depth, and yet you can see these the headlines, right? Christians decline sharply as share of population. You see it in this poll chart. But at the same time, they're trying to be very careful. So notice what else they're saying as a note defining religious affiliation and the study's terminology. Because that idea that Christianity is declining in the U.S., when you consider, they consider as Christian all the groups pretty much that Harold Bloom is talking about in his book as the American religion. He's talking about evangelicals, talking about Mormons, talking about Jehovah's Witness. All these groups are grouped under Christians in this study. And that's the group that this poll claims is shrinking, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Bloom's core idea, his central idea, is too far off the mark. Because if you look at how they define unaffiliated, and that's this box here on the bottom left, a lot of unaffiliated people still consider themselves spiritual. They still pray. They still believe in a God. And when we look at Bloom, you'll see there's this. He starts off with this older research on the idea that 90% of Americans believe that God loves them. Um, that number, the fact that only 70% are Christians, according to the study, doesn't mean that Bloom's number there is still is all that far off the mark. There's still a lot of people who are now unaffiliated who would still consider themselves as spiritual. Uh, they're not connected with an organized faith, but they have some sense of a connection to God, or a God, or a spirit, or something. And so even with this decline in the numbers, and we'll bring these numbers up and we'll look at them as we read Bloom and we discuss the different religions. It doesn't necessarily mean that Bloom's point is off just because a number is low or a number is decreasing in an organized fashion. We have to look at the deeper meanings of things and what people are actually saying about their own faith. Um, and this is where I want to get into. This is a reputable poll, again, to emphasize that point. This isn't like the one that Humphrey was doing in the little clip we saw of Yes Prime Minister. And as you look through this poll, you'll see things that in the appendix they're wanting to put this into a larger context. So Pew talks about other studies that they've done. They give the numbers. They give the way the numbers break down, the expanse of where they've asked the questions. They delve into racial differences, gender differences, married versus unmarried, all these different demographics that can impact the study. They really try to balance this out. They take it very seriously. It's a lot of work that goes into this. And they do a lot of telling, what their margin of error, why the margin of error. They also bring in the fact that this study is in agreement with a lot of other studies on religion in the U.S. This is an important thing to note. And you look at the ones they list from yours, you can link some of them and look. Gallup, I've heard Gallup polls on this, and one that they don't even mention. A lot of times, if you want to see what's going on within a certain group, if you can find a poll done by that group, it gives you a different kind of insight. So there's the Barna organization is an evangelical polling organization. And from what I've read in Barna, they have a similar understanding of the trends in the U.S. as far as religion goes with the U.S. population. So when you have this much agreement from different polls, it really helps you to understand it as a solid poll. All that to say, quantitative matters. It doesn't trump qualitative. It really should be held in relation and connection with qualitative studies and understandings, looking at deeper meanings. And when you use a quantitative study, understand that there's always interpretation, and always look for the best quantitative study that you can find. And always look for corroboration from other studies. Always look for all these details, this fine print, this background, this context. These things are incredibly important to getting valid understanding and valid numerical understanding for what's going on in a study like this and in a population. So I want to keep that in mind. Now, for what you want to look at for this study, because what I just talked about really applies to anything you do with statistics, with studies like this, with quantitative studies. I've taken some classes in communication and ethics, in media ethics, and in health communication and health communication ethics, and all that in the communication we had to really talk about how do you looking at the deeper information within a study, because we have the saying the numbers don't lie, but numbers treated loosely can be made into a misunderstanding or a mistake. Numbers treated loosely can be made to lie. So that's why all that. So all that first part there really applies to any time you're looking at a study, anytime you're looking at polling type research, and how to approach it. But for this Pew study, for this class, what I want you to do right now is, as you're reading it, you want to read the overview and read that in pretty good detail. This is an important part of your learning minutes. This is all calculated in based on page numbers. Look closely, read through it, read the fine print, read the pull-out boxes. Read this first chapter. This is one of the things we're going to come back to again and again. The numbers that are in here, the ideas that are in here. And for now, while we will later look at some of the things on demographics and some of the things on denominations more closely, right now, if you read this Appendix C looking at the context, context is incredibly important for a study like this. So that overview, that first chapter, that context, read those in really serious detail. Read through them closely, carefully, and take your time with them. And use those discussion questions to kind of guide through some of that reading. I think most of those will be answered in those first two chapters that I've pointed to there, the overview in chapter 1. But read that context chapter as well, that appendix. And then after that, you want to get familiar with the rest of the study. This is something we're going to come back to. I list this as one of the two main texts because, as I mentioned before, Bloom's book is going to be a spine. We're going to go through it a chapter, 2 chapters, 3 chapters at a time, something like that, and discuss what he's discussing, pull out things, critique what he says, question what he says. But then sometimes we're going to go back to this polling, in this study, and kind of apply it and look at it in relation to what he's saying. So you want to look at the table of contents and see what's in there, kind of skim over some of the headings throughout those, and skim through the rest of that study, and then be prepared that as we're studying Mormonism, Bloom, we'll see very soon in the next couple of weeks that he sees Mormonism as like kind of the American religion. This is kind of his quintessential American religion. But if that's the case, why so few Mormons in this quantitative research? It's something we have to answer if we're going to take Bloom seriously. So it's good, knowing how to use your kind of Control F in the PDF and search Mormonism and then flip through and find references to Mormonism and see what's going on there and relate it to what Bloom says about Mormons or what Bloom says about Pentecostals. So read those 3 chapters, have this overall familiarity, and we're going to draw on this for the rest of the semester.